You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Hello everybody, and how are we on this fine June Wednesday? Welcome to Haunted Histories on Parasearch Radio with me, your host and guide for the evening, Penny G. Morgan. Now last week we went up to Scotland, Bonnie, Scotland, and looked at Mary King's Close in Edinburgh. Well, we had a comment from the group who look after this area that's called the Real Mary King's Close, and they said, and I quote, "Thank you for featuring us on Parasearch Radio. Although we greatly enjoyed the show, there are a couple of things we think it's worth mentioning. The plague certainly hit Edinburgh, and residents of the close did die of both the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague, different strains with different symptoms but equally unpleasant. But so did many across the UK and Europe. Neither Mary King's nor any of the surrounding closes were walled in, bricked up or anything of the like. In the 1750s, many of the buildings of Edinburgh, including Mary King's Close, were old and in disrepair, so the tops of the buildings of the closes were cropped off, the ceilings of the lower rooms were enforced, and they served as foundations for the Royal Exchange. As you mentioned, Edinburgh's approach to the plague was actually quite modern, with a lot of people suffering being sent to quarantine camps outside the city walls. People were absolutely not walled in to Mary King's Close. The close is shrouded in myths and legends regarding hauntings and unexplained happenings. While paranormal investigations have taken place here, we cannot verify their claims as to whether the site is haunted. We focus on social history, telling the stories of the people who would have lived here when the streets were open to the skies. So, back to me speaking now. If you're ever in Edinburgh, do go and have a look at the close. I'm sure you will find it interesting. But without wanting to sound argumentative, and anyone who knows me is probably laughing at the thought of me not sounding argumentative, I did find historical reports when I was researching for the show saying that areas were walled in, as much actually as I found ones that saying they weren't. And also the show being focused on Edinburgh, which is why I just focused on that particular bit in Edinburgh and the plague. But thank you, the Real Mary King's Close, for commenting on our show, and thank you for listening. If you also remember last week, I mentioned I was going on an investigation of my own this Friday past, with a couple of my good friends, Daisy and Cara, to New Tavern Fort in Gravesend. I can honestly, strongly recommend this place to visit if you're ever in Kent. Even just as a sort of historical visit as a punter, so to speak, as opposed to being a paranormal investigation, it's incredibly interesting and very well laid out with lots to read and see. Special mention also has to be given to our tour guide George. I can honestly say I have never met a young lad of he was about 17 or 18. I can't quite remember exactly how young he was, around that age, but someone of that age range who was able to speak so eloquently and intelligently about history and a site of interest as him. Even if he did ask the host of Haunted Histories if she knew what a V1 rocket was. I didn't slap him or anything, but I did sort of give him my withering look. There was quite a lot of strange activity in this place. I won't go into detail because you never know, there may be a fort show taking place in the future. But it was a very interesting night. In fact, if you're looking for something to do the weekend of September the 23rd or the 24th, the fort is actually having a 40s weekend, which I've already penciled in to the family calendar. You should too. Hey, you might get to meet the presenter of Haunted Histories. Who knows? What more could you want than that? But it looks like it's going to be a good evening. And you know, support local history. And go and have a look if you can get down to... Well, it's not that far from London or anything, is it? But it's a very interesting place with lots of history. Right. So, enough of all that self-promotion. Where are we tonight? Well, the advert says The Mill. Specifically, we'll be talking to Anita of Ghostly Goings on Paranormal about their experiences of a place called Armley Mill in Leeds. Armley was a wool mill, specifically, but I'm going to talk about mill life in general and a very, very short recap of bits to do with the Industrial Revolution. My question is, are you ready? Good. Then I shall begin. Traditionally, the British textile industry was based on wool. Back in the early 1500s, the population was estimated at around 3 million people. But those 3 million people supported actually 8 million sheep, believe it or not. Areas like East Anglia became very rich on wool, with a lot of it being exported to places as far away. Well, bear in mind this is the 1500s, it's a long way away. It's some places like Italy. There were even churches and buildings built on wool, i.e. the profits from the wool in that area. By the middle of the 17th century, cotton cloth was being imported into Britain, but quite soon the manufacturers realised that they could make bigger profits by importing the actual raw cotton as opposed to the finished cloth and weaving it themselves. This did actually present a bit of a problem because machinery wasn't there to make this, hence the start of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to all of this, the turning of raw fleece into wool, which could be used to make cloth, was very, very much a cottage industry. And not just that, it was a family affair. I read that in around 1715 it was estimated that it required around 132 people to turn 240 pounds of wool into cloth, a process that would take around a week in total. And yes, it's true, fleeces were treated with human urine to remove the grease, well, a solution that contained urine anyway. The process for dealing with the raw fleece to the end cloth had a lot of parts to it. They would be cleaned, then combed. This was a quite hazardous job as the wool was heated by charcoal and gave off very noxious fumes. Then it went to the weaver and his family for carding. Carding is kind of pulling the wool between two studded, they almost look like sort of table tennis bats. And then the fibres were ready for spinning. Typically, the women of the family, actually the basis of the word spinster. Then the weaving process. The small child of the family, would be responsible for returning the shuttle every time, as this was before the mechanisation process and mechanised shuttles that returned themselves. Then the cloth was cleaned and shrunk. Then it would be stretched out on something called a tenterframe on hooks. Ever felt like you were on tenterhooks? Yep, that's where that saying came from. Being tense. And then the cloth was cropped, which was actually one of the most highly skilled of the occupations and probably the best paid and had the longest sort of learning process to do it. As time went by, and as demand for new cotton cloth created a need to find a more efficient and speedy way to produce the material, somebody called James Hargreaves invented something called the spinning jenny in 1764. This basically combined, in effect, 8 spinning wheels, rather than the normal just one that the cottage industry women used. Then in 1769, the water-powered spinning frame changed things even more. These machines were powered by a water wheel and became known as water frames. Crompton, in 1779, combined the water frame and the original spinning jenny and created something called the spinning mule, which was able to spin stronger yarn and had more bobbins, if you like, going than both the other machines combined. I know I'm skipping around my history a bit, but there is so much to cover in this era that we couldn't possibly do it all in 25 minutes. But the point I'm making is that the mechanisation was definitely starting before the 1800s, which is when most of us associate the time of the Industrial Revolution as being, during the Victorian era. One of the things that I associate with the mills, rightly or wrongly, is child labour. A lot of these children who worked in the mills were either from local families who the mill was their livelihood, or they were sent from the parish poorhouses. These pauper children would be paid for by the local parish and also supplied with clothes by them, but the mill owners would house and feed them. These houses could have over 100 children living in, and they would sometimes do what is known as hotbed, because when the mills started working 24/7, there was no break in the manufacturing, and when the day shift was getting up to start work, the night shift would be crawling into bed. Now these children were young. We're talking 7, 8, 9 years old, possibly younger in some places. So, not sure it was a very pleasant livelihood. But these mills weren't fun places to be. They were dangerous, noisy, and in some parts of the mills, depending on what was being done there, they were incredibly hot, and in other parts, depending on what was being done there, they were very, very cold. Especially the cotton mills, cotton had to be kept at a certain temperature. They did jobs such as something called doffing, where when the weaving frames were full, they would have to take off the full bobbins and put the empty ones on, then restart the frame. There was also piecing, which was repairing broken threads on machines. Small children would also have to scavenge and clean the machinery, which is scavenging is when they would go underneath and clear all the fluff out and all that kind of thing. Officially, this work was meant to be done when the machine was not running. It was never meant to be done when the machine was actually running. But often it was turned a blind eye to, as a stop machine meant lost profit and potentially lost wages for the operator of the machine. Accidents happened because of this, and sadly and horrifically, it wasn't unusual for a child to be crushed underneath if the overseer restarted the mule before they had got out. If you want, go and have a look on YouTube if you want to see how some of these machines worked, and you could see how horrifically dangerous it would have been to have been crawling around underneath one. Absolutely horrific if you ask me. But there you go, that's what was expected. The hours of work too were long and arduous, even more so for the pauper children. They worked 6 days a week. Everyone worked 6 days a week, sometimes from 6 a.m. in the morning until 7 p.m. in the evening. They would get a short break at about 8:30 when they could have some breakfast, then around 30 minutes midday for lunch. 60-hour weeks were the norm. And bear in mind, these are young children, 7, 8, 9 years old. On a Sunday, these children would have to go to church and then school in the afternoon. A Sunday evening was the only chance they actually had to be children and play. There were various acts brought in to help protect children, and there were even some mill owners who were quite philanthropic and wouldn't employ children under the age of 10, for example. In the 1800s, in 1847, the 10-Hour Act came in. Kind of explains what it was, but this said that certain age groups, they couldn't work more than a certain amount of hours a day. I think under 9 and under, they had to be restricted to less than 10 hours a day. In 1874, the Factory Act, which meant that no child under the age of 10 was allowed to be employed in the factories. Judging by the articles and pieces I've read, this wasn't actually adhered to as strongly as it could have been, and a lot of children still ended up working part-time in the factories to help their families out. As I said earlier, there is so much we could talk about when looking at mill life, but so little time to cover it. We could look at how strict working in the mills were. Most people, a lot of people who worked in the mills, who lived in the housing that backed onto them, didn't have clocks. So they would listen for the bell, the mill bell, to start ringing. And if you weren't clocked in and ready to start work by the time the bell finished, you would be docked pay, or sometimes even sacked as a result. Many towns and cities were called mill towns, and the whole town grew up and developed around the mill. many large towns in the north, and it wasn't just Lancashire and Yorkshire, there was other parts of the north that had them as well. A lot of the prerequisite of having a mill was that there was running water nearby, because a lot of these mills were, at that time, powered by water. So many of these towns had more than one mill, and many families and livelihoods revolved around the mill. My late grandmother is a prime example. She grew up in a place called Lee. It's classed as Greater Manchester now, but it's actually near Lancashire, in Lancashire. It's a borough of Wigan. And she grew up in the shadow of one of the many mills in the town. I remember her telling me, when I was a small child, that sometimes she would go with her mum to take her uncle his lunch when it was lunchtime. And so that would have been my great-great-uncle. I guess probably around 1925, mid-1920s, because she would have been born, I think, 1919. So the main memory she had of going into the mill was the constant noise and the smell of the oil and the sweat. She told me that the noise was overwhelming and you couldn't hear yourself think, let alone speak to someone. This was why a lot of mill workers developed an ability to lip read, which many kept into their retirement. They also had their own version of sign language. I guess under today's health and safety, they would probably have only been able to work in that noise for a very short amount of time, and that would have been even with ear defenders on. It must have been deafening with all that machinery going constantly. So not only dangerous, noisy, smelly, long days, damaging to your hearing as well. Sadly, and I was sad about this, the mill that stood near my grandmother's house when I was growing up got pulled down about 20 years ago to make way for more houses. And I was actually quite almost upset when I saw it being demolished gradually when I used to go and see my grandmother, because it was part of my childhood. It meant every time I saw her we were only minutes away from my nan's house. So I was actually quite upset when they started seeing it gradually get pulled down bit by bit. There aren't, sadly, many mills around anymore that you can actually visit, but there are a few, if you choose to look. You can visit a place called Saltaire it's near Bradford, and that was a mill village built by somebody called Sir Titus Salt. It's actually it's a proper village, people do actually live there, but it was built entirely by the mill owner to take care of his workers. Although amusingly enough, he built a hospital, he built shops, he built schools. He wouldn't build a pub because he didn't want them congregating in groups larger than, I think it was about 7 or 8, as he felt then they might be plotting something untoward towards the working mass. You've got somewhere called Masson Mills in Derbyshire, which is one of the Arkwright mills, and Arkwright is actually quite a famous name when you're looking into the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, Armley Mills in Leeds, which we'll be talking to Anita about very shortly. So let's have a quick look at Armley. They believe there's been some kind of mill in operation in Armley back in the 1500s, albeit on a very, very small level. But by 1788, this mill was equipped with 5 water wheels, driving 18 fulling stocks. Now, fulling was a necessary but dirty process. Remember, this is a wool mill, where woven wool is felted. The bundles of cloth would be hit repeatedly by large hammers, called the fulling stocks, while soaked in water, again, human urine, and a clay known as fuller's earth. The urine, because it is a source of ammonia, would actually be collected from neighbouring houses, and these people specifically saved it for this purpose. Quite gross, really, when you think about it, but, you know, it had a use, and, it was one way to get rid of it before sewage systems, I guess. The mills were sold in 1788, 10 years after the new canal opened outside, and it was bought by a Colonel Thomas Lloyd. He was a Leeds cloth merchant who, working on the mill, expanded it to be the world's largest woolen mill. He then leased the running of the mills to Israel and John Burroughs. They built a semi-detached house for themselves on the far bank of the canal and lived by the mill. In 1804, the mills were sold to a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Gott, but in 1805 they burnt down. These early mills were complete fire hazards, the fibres in the air igniting and setting fire to the very flammable structures inside. There was a lot of wood and things like that in these mills. Gott actually rebuilt the mill using fireproof principles. The mill structure survives to this day, and it's this structure that has achieved the Grade 2 listing that it now has. Gott himself was actually the owner of several Woolen mills. He died in 1840 and was succeeded by his sons John and William Gott. They introduced a steam engine, to supplement the water wheels in 1850, but in the 1860s the water wheels were completely phased out. One of the things you look at when you look at the history of the mills is the fact that a lot of them did have a combination of water and steam, and it was only towards sort of the latter end of the 1800s that water was phased out as a means of power, and the steam engines were brought in more strongly. In fact, there's a mill in Lee, I was mentioning where my grandmother was from, and they've actually now got sponsorship to restore what was the steam engine room in that mill, to hopefully open it to the public. Gott himself was a very fundamental figure in Leeds history. Not only was he one of the largest and probably the richest employers in the UK in his time, he was also the mayor of Leeds in 1799, prior to buying Armley from Colonel Lloyd. By 1907, part of the mill had been let out to tenants. The woolen clothing manufacturers Bentley and Tempest took over the mill. In fact, interestingly enough, I think this is quite interesting, one of the founders of Bentley and Tempest, Stuart Tempest, began his working life at Armley as what they call a half-timer at the age of 6 in the 1840s. Obviously was in his blood, so he ends up setting up his own business. Good for him. The mill closed in 1971. Like many of the old textile mills, it was unable to keep up with foreign competition. Imports were getting cheaper than actually making it yourself. Plus, you had the increasing use of man-made fibres to be making clothes from, and even the breaking up of the British Empire contributed to the mills around the UK gradually closing. Now, Armley is a museum that you can go and look at, and a very interesting one too. Just as an aside, before I hand over to my interview with Anita, there are actually YouTube videos you can go and have a look at of people touring the museum with the mule, the spinning mule I mentioned earlier, working. You can see how dangerous and just outright noisy it would have been, and that's with only one machine working. Imagine a whole floor of them going if you have a look. But do take a look, because it is actually quite interesting, and it's part of our history, it's part of our heritage. Now, history lesson over. Shall we move over to the second half? But before we do, here's a quick message from our friend Harry. We achieve paranormal miracles here at Parasearch Radio.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And we're back. I'm delighted to be joined by Anita of Ghostly Goings On Paranormal, who run investigations all over the UK, but have investigated Armley Mills in the past. Hi, Anita.
Hello. Good evening.
Hi. So, how did you become a paranormal investigator? What triggered it?
Wow, let me start at the beginning, shall I?
It's always a good place to start, isn't it? Start at the beginning.
Place, definitely. Well, my first experience with the paranormal started in 1978 whilst I was serving in the Women's Royal Army Corps in Germany.
All right, okay.
Yes, I know. And it was actually a 4-man room that I was sharing with 3 other females. And I'd gone to bed early one evening. It was about 9 o'clock because I was on duty the next morning pretty early. And you know when you're just dropping off to sleep and then, I don't know, something disturbs you. And I opened my eyes and what I thought I saw at the bottom of my bed was a figure of a young man, blonde hair, about 5'7", must have been about 16, 17. And then I thought, I'm dreaming this. So I shut my eyes again, opened them, and he wasn't there. So I thought, no, I must have been dreaming. So off I went again to sleep. About half hour later, I had the doors flung open, the lights were switched on, and my friend come in, and she was shaking and walking up and down. And I said, oh gosh, whatever's the matter. And I kind of had an idea because they'd been dabbling with, dare I say, a Ouija board for a couple of months on and off.
Okay.
And I had said to them a few times, look, don't dabble with things that you don't fully understand. Anyway, to cut a long story short, because it is quite a long story, she asked me to walk her down to the bathroom she needed to go. So we're chit-chatting away, come back, and I said, right, I'll put the kettle on. You're clearly shaking about something, and I'll make you a cup of tea. Calm down, we'll have a chat. So I made her a cup of tea. We got talking, and she then decided to tell me that the person or spirit that they had through on the Ouija board was her brother. Now, bearing in mind, I knew this girl quite well, but I never knew she had a brother, let alone a brother that had passed away at 16 on a motorbike accident. Right. So she's telling me the story of how he died and kind of describing a bit to me what he looked like. And I stopped her and I said, right, have you got a picture of your brother? So, of course, she showed me a picture of her brother. And it was the figure that I'd seen at the bottom of my bed.
Wow.
So from that moment on, I didn't get back into it until I then returned to England 5 years later. Mm-hmm. But I've always had a fascination. I've always known there is an afterlife. What it is, I have no idea because obviously I'm not there yet, and I hope not to be for a very long time. But then I started to go on joining groups, going on ghost events, myself ghost hunts, if you want to call them. And then when my daughter turned 18, she decided she wanted to join me as well. And that's how I really got into the paranormal, was just by having that experience all those years ago, but always knowing there was something and having, I don't know, going to places and picking up things, having images, feeling things, but kind of putting it to the back of my mind because I'm thinking, no, I'm imagining like you do, because you don't fully understand things. And then for the last 5-6 years, like I said, I've been going on investigations and as a guest, and then eventually joining Ghostly Goings On 3 years ago as an investigator.
Brilliant.
So that's how I became interested or became a paranormal investigator.
Because my experience of army personnel is some of them believe in it more than like your average person would, and some of them it's completely the opposite. They're so anti the paranormal.
Yes, I know.
But there's no sort of happy medium, if you pardon the pun. No. There's no sort of middle ground on it. They're either very, very, it's real, and they will argue the toss with anyone who says it's not, to the point where if you believe in it, you must be nuts and you're going to be
I know exactly.
Locked behind a door. There's no sort of there's no middle ground.
Yeah, I mean, when I relayed that story to some other of my colleagues when I was in Germany, they kind of looked at me as if to say, "Well, you must have seen Caroline's brother's picture." I said, "No, I never even knew that she had a brother that had passed away." So, but I always think, Penny, to be honest, people, unless they experience something themselves, they're never going to believe anyway. So, you can tell your stories and relay your experiences, but until they've actually experienced something, they're either going to be sat on the fence or a complete non-believer. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. So what has been that must have been a pretty unnerving experience. What has been your most unnerving investigation to date?
Oh, well, I would say, up until last Saturday, it would have been Woodchester Mansion and Herefordshire Hall.
It's funny you mention Woodchester, because that's actually one of my colleagues said last week. That has actually been one of his most unnerving and his most favourite.
Yes.
Both.
Yes, Woodchester is quite local to us here, because it's just down the road in Gloucester, obviously Stroud, and we go there quite regular. And it's a very how can I say? It's a very gothic. Have you been to Woodchester yourself?
No, I haven't. But when I say my colleague on last week's show, Andy, he was one of the first groups ever allowed to investigate it.
I mean, as you drive down to the mansion, you go down this long drive. It's about 1.5 miles long, I think, till you get down to the actual mansion. And as you see it there, and it's magnificent. It really is an old Gothic mansion that's never ever been completed. But as you walk through the door and go into the corridor into one of the main rooms, and you walk through little side rooms to the side at a chapel area, you get this, I don't know, the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I always find it's colder in Woodchester than outside. You just walk in and you just feel there is definitely something very unnerving there, and very I'm not going to say demonic, but very, it makes you feel very uneasy when you walk round. And it's one place I will not walk round on my own regardless. Really? Yes, yeah.
But you say something has trumped Woodchester recently.
Yes, recently. Now, last Saturday evening, we were lucky enough as a team to have Redoubt Fort in Harwich to ourselves. There were 6 females investigating. We entered at 7 o'clock. And it was locked down. There was nobody else within the fort. It was just 6 females. It was 4 of our team members and 2 of our friends off another team. And I must say, I don't get unnerved very easily, as any of the team will tell you. They call me the Sergeant Major because they say I'm like I'm still in the army sometimes with my way that I do things. But we were all in the cells. It was quite funny actually. We were in one cell and we had all motion lights out, equipment, things, and I'm at the front for some reason. They push me to the front and they're all huddled behind me. The lights are going off left, right and centre. Our other equipment was going off, the heat sensor was going off, and like, I'm stood in front like that. I said, if you push me anymore, I'm going to be in that corridor on my own. And I said, I really don't want to be there at the moment. But whatever was there, I can't explain, but it made me so nervous, on edge. And I definitely I'm going to do a return visit there. Well, we also we're going to definitely do another investigation there, because I think we've only just touched the surface there.
You need to give me a shout then, because that is just up the road from me in Essex. So I seem to have weird experiences at military places.
I know.
The military places and me there's some link there, and I don't know what it is.
Yes. Perhaps in a previous life, Penny, you might have been...
Maybe.
But I were in the middle of the fort, because obviously it goes round, and there was a grass area in the middle, and we all decided what we would do. We'd stand in the middle and we'd put all motion lights all round the circle in front of every room, and we're in the middle, we're trying to call out, and we heard noises, things that we couldn't explain, and then we're talking, and all of a sudden one of the motion lights triggered off, and 2 of the ladies that were with me looked up and they saw a shadow run across the top of the fort, on the top step, I suppose it is, on the top where gun turrets are. And it was that quick, but both of them saw it at the same time. Just after the light had been triggered. So, and all one of us said we were really, really nervous and felt really uneasy. We don't know what it was. None of us would go to the toilet alone. We went in twos.
It could be because women weren't allowed. I mean, I did New Tavern Fort last week, and there was a certain corridor that this one room is like where they would have stored obviously the gunpowder, all the charges, all the shells. They kept them obviously quite separate because of if one caught the other one, the whole place was going to go boom. But this one room, they said that we found out subsequently that all women who walk past it feel like someone's just thumped them in the chest, like to tell them to get out. And none of the men felt it, only the women. And as I was saying to them, well, women wouldn't have been allowed down here. I mean, you might have got the commander's wife living on site in the fort, but there's no way she'd have been allowed in the areas where the men were working.
No, exactly.
So it could have been spirits that were a bit sort of like, there shouldn't be women here, go away.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
hence the uncomfortable sort of... But I kind of started to call this spirit out when I went into the room on my own, and I couldn't work out if he was if he I presume it's a he was actually backing down, or was getting angrier, because he wasn't. He was draining the energy. He was dropping the temperature in the room by a hell of a lot. But we were saying about skeptics. This young lad who'd been sent in there on his own at the beginning of the night, he was very sort of like blasé, like it doesn't happen. But when he saw the experiences I was having in there, and he was feeling the temperature change, he could smell the oil, for one of it. It was like oil and sweat. It was that kind of smell that was hitting us. His opinion changed quite fast.
Wow.
He actually admitted he was scared.
Yeah.
He admitted to me he was scared. This big 6'1", 6'2" bloke in his 20s. He was scared. I wasn't scared, but I was quite sort of, I wish I could have stayed in there longer. But that could have been the whole thing. The fact that it was all women, the spirits were a bit like, what the hell are you doing here?
Well, possibly. I mean, we had 6 experienced paranormal investigators, all female, but we all felt very unnerved, uneasy, didn't feel comfortable at all. But like you say, it probably was because we were females. So, but we are definitely putting that on our calendar to return. So we're actually doing an event there in September with the Ghost Chasers. So we've got a good insight to the area now and everything, so which is really good. So, yes, brilliant.
Well, if I do a show on it, I might have to give you a shout then, and we can talk about that one. So what's been your favourite place to investigate, and why?
Gosh.
Or one of your favourites? You can give me a couple, I'll let you.
Okay. My most personal one is got to be, I'm from Hereford, and we do Herefordshire Hall quite often. And we were doing an investigation there. It was, I'm not sure if it was last year, the year before. No, it was the year before. And down in the cells again, believe it or not, I was running a group with Danny, who's the founder of GGO.
Okay.
And we were all in this one cell at the end of the corridor. We had some motion lights out in the corridor, and we had the Echo Box going. Have you heard of the Echo Box? It is an app that you can download onto. No, we're not lovers of apps, but this is absolutely a phenomenal piece of equipment or an app.
I think I've heard of it, but I can't picture it.
It's just basically a bank of phonetics and sounds.
Oh yeah.
And it sounds really weird when you actually listen to it. It's just like ooh, ah, it like that. But I don't know what happens, but we do get conversations coming through. We get names coming through. We get whole sentences. Anyway, we were having a lot coming through on the Echo Box, and I asked. Oh, I think no. Actually, it was Danny that asked the question. Would you like somebody to go and stand in the corridor on their own? And as clear as day, it come across Anita. So off I went into the corridor, back to the wall, and I started to call out, and I said, if you'd like to step forward, walk in front of the white box on the floor. And just as I said that, the light triggered. It came on the motion sensor light, and the word light come through on the Echo Box. So of course, kind of like startled me quite. It didn't frighten me, didn't unnerve me. It just kind of took me by surprise. Yeah. So kind of ran back into the cell, and then on the Echo Box it said, "Don't run." Now that to me, I know, and it was caught on camera. We put it on our YouTube channel as well, actually. So you can look at that. But that to me was my most personal experience ever, and it was brilliant because I actually live in Hereford. I grew up around the Herefordshire Hall, knowing years when I was growing up that there was. It's such a phenomenal building, and I've always wanted to go in and have a look round. And I mean, they have an actual working court there, so you can go in the courtroom on an investigation, but you can't obviously touch anything because there's and that going. But even the courtroom there, when you go in, you just get this overwhelmed feeling of sadness when you walk in. It's really, really bizarre and strange. But for me, that's my most personal and one of my favourite venues. my other one is we've only ever done it twice, and that's, I don't know if you've heard of it, Revesby Abbey in Lincolnshire.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's not very well known. It's not advertised a lot, but we've done 2 investigations there now. The second being about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And another phenomenal, magnificent building. And as you enter, you think the grandeur that was there. It's a Grade 1 listed building, and they're actually restoring it bit by bit. We only have access to the servants' quarters, and it's below ground level, so you actually walk down into the quarters.
Oh.
But table tipping there, I have never ever in my life experienced the table tipping that we had at Revesby Abbey. And you know, sometimes we do the table tipping, and I am a bit sceptic about it. I'll admit it, because you know, people can push on the table, but literally the 4 people that were on this table are quite regular guests of ours, so we kind of got to know them.
Yeah.
And we had, this table was moving from one end of the room to the other on command. We were asking it to move, change direction, and it was just mind-blowing. That's all I can say. And that is another one of my favourite venues, because you never know what it's going to throw at when you go there, but when you do, you can't be disappointed. We've had so much there, so yeah, so that's 2 of my favourite. I could be here all night because I have loads. But you know,
so is there anywhere that you would love to investigate, anywhere in the world?
Oh gosh,
money is no object. You can go anywhere.
Money no object. There's quite a few. I mean, I would love to go to America, to be honest, and do Alcatraz. I mean, everybody says that, I know, but I would love to go there and do that an investigation there. I would love it.
Well, I can tell you I've been to Alcatraz as a punter, as not as for an investigation, because they don't really do them that often, because obviously how difficult it is to get to it and everything. But I've been there as a guest, as a punter, and I must admit, I didn't get much feeling from the sales. I think it's kind of been over-touristed, if that makes sense. It's kind of worn it out a bit. But the weirdest thing was, I was sitting on the steps in the rec yard, and my friend I was staying with, he took a photo of me, and I'm just staring off. What I was actually sitting there thinking was, actually, this ain't too bad to have been sat here. You know, it's quite peaceful. Then again, it probably wouldn't have been when you could see it, you know, knowing your friends and family were the other side of the water. But then what was really weird is we found a picture of Al Capone when he was there.
Yes,
he is sitting in exactly the same place that I was.
Oh my gosh, wow.
And that kind of, when we found it, because my friend, he's a PhD in maths and all that, he was kind of like, this sort of thing doesn't even he went, that's weird. Has he got his name on the stone? No, but this one, you know, you can imagine they had those stone steps that they could sit on. This one I'm sitting on, and the way I'm sitting, it's a mirror image, and it's very weird. I kind of was I was a bit kind of, that's weird. Yeah. That is weird, because he wasn't there for very long.
No.
But yeah, it's a fascinating place.
Yes, definitely.
But I'd want to go into the underground bit if I was going to investigate it. The bit that doesn't get visited very often. But yeah, that's my Alcatraz experience. Anywhere else in the States?
I'd like to go to Salem, actually, to be where the witches are. So,
yeah, I can get that. I get that.
Yeah. Definitely.
I'd like to do some of the asylums and stuff out there, because you just don't get them anymore in this country.
No, you don't. No, we did the towers in Leicestershire a couple of years ago, and it's funny talking about the Echo Box there. That was our first experience with it. We were doing an investigation there, and Danny was with an old team member up in one of the wards, and they had the Echo Box running. And on the Echo Box it said Stephen. Right, this investigator's name was Stephen.
Yeah.
So, and then it said window. So he said, my name is Stephen. Would you like me to go and stand by the window? So he actually walked over to the window. And as he went over to the window, he noticed there were about a group of 12 guys jumping out of these cars, actually jumping over the fences and breaking into the asylum. So at that point, obviously, we had to then call the police and security, and then we take all the guests back to the base room for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, while the police come and actually escorted all these people off the premises. But if he hadn't have actually at that precise moment gone to the window like the Echo Vox asked him to, they would have just broken in, and we wouldn't have known. So to me, that was another one. See, I'm divulging now because I have so much I could to tell you.
All right. That's all right.
Yeah, asylums, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I would agree with you on that one.
So let's get on to the subject in question, Armley.
Okay. Yes.
Let's talk about Armley. It's an amazing looking building from what I've seen of it, but it's also quite scary looking, quite intimidating looking, which most of the mills were, with the big windows and all very sort of symmetrical. Everything was very sort of, and it's I think it's hard to actually imagine the noise and the smell and everything that would have emanated from them. But I still think it's a beautiful building at the same time. I'm a bit weird like that.
Definitely. No. Armley Mills is very beautiful, I must admit. You drive down up to the mill. You park your car in the car park, and then you walk up to the front door. But as you walk through the door, you've got the reception area. They have a little counter. Then you go to the right, and you have like a cafe, which was our base room. And it's not actually. It didn't feel very intimidating when you walk into that area. But once you walk through a set of double doors to the left-hand side, you actually walk into the mill itself with all the all the machinery and everything, and the smell hits you also. Like you said, although it's not a working mill anymore, you can still smell.
Yeah,
you get that smell as you walk in, and then you see all the looms and everything are there, and all the heavy machinery, and you thought, my gosh, it was absolutely magnificent. We arrived, it was actually June this time last year that we went, and we arrived and it was still light, so we had a walk around with the people that were hosting us that night as well, and she gave us a bit of a tour around, showed us the different areas. So obviously the first one were all the looms and the machinery and everything. And then we went down some stairs into another area, which they called the sewing room, or the sewing area, where all the females used to work on the machines.
Yep.
And a lot of the original sewing machines were still all there. And you envisioned in your mind all the females sat there day to day with the machines going, with the heads down. And then you had an area that they used to do, I suppose, I don't know if they called a matron or somebody that was in charge of the females. That you could see where she used to sit and watch over them working.
Yeah, it would have been like an overseer, the person who was supervisor sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And then actually it was really odd, because on the same level you went through some more doors, and then they actually had a theatre. But the seats, and it was done out like a really like an old-fashioned theatre, I call it, the really old seats where you pull up and down, the seats flick back up, and then they had a bit of a stage. It wasn't very big, but they told us that the seats actually didn't belong to the mill. They'd been bought in, but they'd had a lot of, we got some quite bizarre activity within that theatre. There was a not so nice gentleman with a top hat. That's what a lot of the guests were picking up on, and what we picked up on. Motion lights going off, lots of noises, banging and footsteps.
So this gentleman with the top hat that was in the theatre, do you think he was actually factory, or do you think he was with the seats that were brought in?
I personally think he was with the seats. I don't think he had anything to do with the theatre.
Because it would have been unusual for someone. The only person really who would have worn a top hat in a factory like that would have been possibly the owner.
The owner, exactly.
And was it Stott was the main owner who owned it in the 1800s, something like that? He was meant to be quite a decent bloke. He was, he was kind of a hero to Leeds almost because of what he did for the city. So maybe the seats were.
Yeah, I don't personally think he was connected to the building. I think it was to the actual seats that were in the theatre that they'd installed. But it's such. And then obviously when the lights went out, we started the investigation. We had, up in the actual mill itself, we had a lot of children coming through. Quite sad, some of the stories that we were we got. I actually had a sensitive in my first group, and he was relaying quite some really upsetting stories about the children, how they were ill-treated, they were worked hard, they were allowed about an hour's sleep a day, and then we had another group in at the same time working a planchette, and they had beautiful, and this little boy come through, and it was quite sad, trying to find his mum. And we had he was trying to draw. Obviously, he couldn't write, but it was going round the table, and it was responding to questions. I think he was trying to draw us a picture, but he never quite made it. He couldn't quite do that. But that was quite not oppressive in there. It was quite sad. Yeah. That area, and then the women's section, when we went into the sewing room, we had some phenomenal table tipping in there, and I mean phenomenal table tipping in there as well. It went from one end of the room to the other, and apparently it was a lady, I think if I remember rightly, her name was Maggie, which was quite a strong. We had one of the ladies that was hosting that night, or worked at the mill, came in with us, and this Maggie is quite drawn to this lady because obviously she knows her. But once Maggie left the room, the table tipping kind of went quiet. Right. But as soon as she came back in, it started again, responding to questions. It was doing what we asked. When this lady, she was called Pam, talked, it was going bizarre. It was really amazing. I couldn't explain it. So, but absolutely beautiful building even now to this day, and you can imagine in your head, in your mind's eye, what it must have been like when it was a working mill.
Noisy.
very noisy, because a lot of the original machinery is obviously still there, and it's just it's a magnificent place, absolutely magnificent.
The room though that the mules were in, those machines that would take the yarn and put it onto the bobbins, that room. What sort of vibes did you get from that room? Or is that where the children were picked up?
That's where it's funny because there was two sections to that room. The first bit where all the looms and everything were, and then the second bit, there were a few machines in there, but not as many. And the children seemed to be in the second bit, but when we moved back then into the front bit, we asked the children to come forward, and it was as if they weren't allowed to come and talk to us or communicate with us in where all the bigger machinery was. So, but the first part, you felt something. What it was, I can't explain it. But once you went into the section, into the area where the children were, terrible sadness, really. And all the guests felt that as well. I think one of our guests was quite overcome with emotion. They were obviously picking up on the children's feelings. And
did any of the guests know how children would have been used in the mills at this point?
Yes, not at that point. We had one gentleman that was actually from up in Leeds, so he knew a lot about the mill, and he was quite sensitive. And he got quite emotional, and I think, if I remember rightly, he picked up on a little boy and a little girl, and there had been a fire at the mill.
That's in 1805.
Yes, and they'd been caught up in the fire, and that's how they lost their lives.
Right.
So was in the fire. So, but absolutely. I mean, we said we're going to definitely go back again, because I think, you always get something different every time you go, because obviously it depends on the guests that you have with you as well. Their input to everything. But a phenomenal place. If anybody ever gets a chance to visit, even in the daytime, just go and have a walk around.
It doesn't actually surprise me that it was predominantly children you felt coming through, because I think, especially in the early to mid 1800s, so many young children. I mean, we're talking 5, 6, 7-year-olds would have been working, especially where those mules were, because they would have been responsible for going underneath them to clean them out and replacing the bobbins and things. And if the overseers didn't want to lose money, they wouldn't switch them off where these kids were going. And if there is YouTube videos of these things working, they'd scare me just to be operating it as an adult, let alone as a child trying to crawl underneath it. So it doesn't surprise me that children would have been and the fact that a lot of them, they would work 6 days a week, 12, 13 hours a day, and that's all they did. These were small children. It doesn't surprise me that that's all they know, and therefore that's what they've returned to, so to speak. But that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much for that description of the place. It's say with the stuff I was telling you about my sort of family history in Lee and Lancashire and the cotton mills and stuff, the mills. I wish there was more mills around that you could still go and visit and see what it would have been like in its day. Although I did read a rumour they're doing one in Lee at the moment. They've decided to try and save it and protect it, and are working on the steam room at the moment. So
yeah.
Fingers crossed.
We actually went to Thwaite Mills in Leeds 3 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Also, that's another was a working mill. It's like a water mill.
Yeah.
And there was a story of the manager's son losing his life while he was cleaning the water mill itself.
Yeah.
That was quite a phenomenal place as well.
They are fascinating. They're fascinating places.
Definitely.
So, bit of a promo for Ghostly Goings On. What events have you got coming up, and how do people book?
Well, I don't know if anybody knows, but we've recently joined up with Ghost Chasers that were on Insight TV with Ian Lawman, Paul Hobday and Chris Howley.
Right.
We've got a few events coming up with them. Our best one is, though, that we're actually going to Germany for Halloween this year.
Oh, blimey.
If anyone has watched the Ghost Chasers episodes, they would have seen one with the Berg Rickstein Castle. Mm-hmm. We're actually going there for Halloween and doing an investigation there on Halloween itself. We leave on the 29th of October. We travel over to Germany and we get to actually investigate 2 castles. But the one that was shown on the programme, we're actually going to be investigating on Halloween itself. So we've got that one coming up, which we're really looking forward to as a team. We can't wait. Absolutely wonderful. So we're all trying to learn German now. So
you lived in Germany for a while. You should be all right.
I know the basics, but I'm not. That was many years ago, Penny. But we've got.
You need to learn how to ask for beer and chocolate.
No, I'm beer bitter. That'll be fine. 1 beer, please. So. We're also
Red Bull. Red Bull's going to be necessary if you're doing ghost investigations. We're lucky enough to book HMP Shepton Mallet Prison, which I believe I'm really looking forward to that one as well, and the Gloucester Prison we're doing. Well, in fact, we're doing loads. So, I mean, if anybody's interested, they'd like to just head over to www.ghostlygoingson.com and they can see all our events there. And you've got a Facebook page as well, I believe.
Page as well. Log on and have a look at us on there and follow us. And we've got lots coming up,
Wonderful.
Exciting times for us. So,
Wonderful.
a lot of our events, I must admit, are sold out. They do sell out pretty quick, which is great.
Yeah.
But we do still have some events available, and we do get cancellations, and you can go on the cancellation list as well if need be.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Anita. I do really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
As always, if anyone listening has anything they would like to share with us about any of the places we've discussed tonight in tonight's show, or any that you know that we've got coming up, please do get in touch with us, Parasearch Radio. And that just leaves me to say, have a good evening all, sleep tight, and don't get too scared about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.